Nearly a week after the November Democratic debate, a senior advisor to Vice President Joe Biden left the campaign alleging that the campaign failed to heed her advice on immigration.
She also reportedly expressed concerns about Biden's rhetoric and his record on immigration during the Obama administration. Meanwhile, several of the Democratic campaigns have come under scrutiny by Hispanic leaders who say candidates have not paid enough attention to Latino voters. The Hill's Rafael Bernal joins us now to expand on this and to discuss the different policies being championed by the Democratic presidential hopefuls. Rafael, great to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Happy Thanksgiving Eve.
Yeah.
Happy Thanksgiving Eve.
First, let's talk about this Biden advisor who left. Do you have any intel on what were sort of the concerns there, or what the impact on his campaign might be?
So on the concerns, it's basically, there's a big rumor mill. She's been very discreet. She keeps a good relationship with the people in the campaign, which is a sign of something. But the rumor mill, very credible, says that she didn't like the laser focus on Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina, because Nevada is going to be sort of the first step for the Latino vote.
Right.
And the Latino vote is going to be huge in this primary because it's going to come in full force on Super Tuesday. And the weird thing, so I was looking at polling numbers. I don't know how much credibility you give to 538's numbers.
No,
Some
they're
people
good.
love
Yeah,
them.
they're good. Yeah.
It's
a good
them.
aggregator. Yeah.
And what they're aggregating is Biden actually has pretty strong leads. He's no, I keep saying he's no Jeb Bush of 2020. He has strong leads. He can keep them. And if he does really well on Super Tuesday, he could be the presumptive nominee.
Yeah.
Very quickly.
We've been saying that as well.
We talk about that a lot, Ralph. You're absolutely right. And it's fascinating that his campaign is not giving enough credence, because that is where Bernie is really looking to mount a big challenge, as I understand it. I'm sure your reporting is consistent as well. He's got huge amounts of support, donor support in the Latino community, and a massive ground game in California.
That is exactly right.
Yeah.
Bernie's looking at Nevada and California. He knows that the early states, New Hampshire, he's always got a shot. New Hampshire loves Bernie.
Right.
But young Latinos, and we've talked about this before, young Latinos are very easily turned into Bernie bros. They're sort of the natural Bernie bro is a 27-year-old Mexican-American from the West who feels he could be doing better. And Bernie knows this. Our friend Chuck Rocha knows this, and their strategy is hinging on this. But the question remains, and I think this is part of the Vanessa Cárdenas quitting, why isn't Joe Biden's strategy hinging on this? Is there something that he believes that talking about these issues that will help him get these California voters, now that California voters matter for once in a Democratic primary?
Right.
Yeah, right.
Does he believe that's going to hurt him in Iowa or South Carolina?
My theory is
Texas goes at that same time as well. I mean, you've got a lot up for grabs, and this constituency is incredibly important. And we should always be clear, immigration is not the only thing that this group of voters cares about, but it is an important issue. What are the main differentiators between the candidates in terms of their plans on immigration?
I mean, they're all over the place. There are the progressives, and Castro, I sometimes don't want to put him in with the progressives, but on immigration, he certainly is at the forefront of a progressive plan. And they're tear down the Trump machine. And they're not asking to tear down the Trump machine to go back to what Obama had. They're very critical of Obama's at least first term in office on immigration.
And Biden.
And by connection,
by
Biden.
proxy, right?
Yeah, by proxy, Biden. He was in the room. Whether he complained or not, he hasn't said. And
he avoids that question.
He does avoid that question very consistently. And they're basically talking about a moratorium on deportations is very big, decriminalizing border crossings, as they were in practice until Trump. But they want to do this in statute, and restructuring DHS, which is a claim that might actually get some pickup on the right, because DHS is a very big bureaucratic animal, and sort of a libertarian conservatism doesn't tie very well to something that size.
Yeah, I would say, Rafael, I think the reason that Biden has not talked a lot about this is he has to look at the Midwestern states, right? Like the swing states in which he could conceivably beat Trump if he were to be the nominee. I mean, ultimately, what we saw in the polling is a lot of this stuff, the decriminalization of the border in particular, that does not play well in the Midwest amongst non-college educated whites, in which a lot of this is where the election ultimately, that's what it's going to come down to, right? It's going to come down to these 6 swing states, particularly these Midwestern states, and with that population in particular, some of this rhetoric doesn't seem to appeal to them.
And that's fascinating. That's one of the things Castro's complaining about. Castro's saying, like, you're basically ceding the moral high ground, saying to these voters in the Midwest, Trump is right. Being a liberal doesn't include having a heart for people at the border, on either side of the border, in whatever circumstance, whether it be migrants or people who are living in El Paso.
Yeah.
And he's making the argument that that's wrong, and that's sort of abandoning, in his view, probably the Democrats' principles, but it's certainly abandoning potential migrants coming, especially from the hemisphere.
Well, and at the same time, I mean, how important really is immigration within the Democratic primary electorate? We've been looking at some of the polling, shows it as, not one of the top concerns. It's roughly 6% who list it as their top priority and concern, really consistent across demographic groups, across race groups, across education, income, et cetera. And when you look at the primary field, who are the candidates who are most closely associated with immigration? It really was Beto and is Julian Castro, neither of whom has performed well.
That's right. And among Latinos, immigration is never even in the top. Well, it sometimes breaks the top 5, but it's a very small number 5.
But it's the same for Latino. It's healthcare, it's jobs, it's the economy,
kitchen
it's
table
climate
issues.
change.
It's the same thing. But immigration does play a special role. It is a litmus test issue. It is. I've heard it compared to affirmative action for African American voters. It's not the top of their list, but if you're against affirmative action, you probably are not going to go, campaign with African American voters. It's like women's right for women. If you, as a candidate, signal to a group that you're not really sure they're welcome, or their relatives are welcome, or people in their larger community are welcome, then it's a lot harder to get them to listen on the kitchen table issues that they do care
I
about.
think that's probably right.
What did you make of, there was a moment we played here on the show where Biden was being challenged by an immigration activist asking him about the deportations that occurred under the Obama administration. And Biden's response was, well, then go vote for Trump.
It was not the ideal response.
Right.
It's not, for a very practiced politician to lose his patience like that. But he has been listening to that sort of protest since he was vice president, and probably since before, because remember, he was a Democrat in the 90s when Democrats had a rhetoric about immigration that was very similar to Trump's now. They just never enacted it.
Oh, yeah, I've seen it. Support, build a wall, build a fence.
Harry Reid famously apologized.
Sanctuary city. But that's kind of why I think it might be good politics for him to be doing that, which is that, look, if he could win the nomination without ceding some of the ground on immigration to the progressive left and go into the general election, he could run on or he could at least say, I have a more pragmatic approach to immigration, but I believe that we should enforce the rule of law. That is something that, from a general election point of view, is probably a better place to be.
It's a better place to be in probably Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. The question is with Hispanics. Hispanics are arguing this is an election where you need to bring out people who've never voted before. And the DNC's strategy. You need to register, teach them how to vote, go around any voter suppression techniques that their particular jurisdiction may have. And this is an expensive and complicated proposition. If you're not exciting them from the get-go, if you're basically giving them lip service and telling, going up to the Midwest and saying, like, don't tell these guys, but we're actually going to be pretty tough on them, and then you go, and now we need you to enter into this very complicated process, it makes that job a lot more difficult. And to your point, Texas, it makes Texas a lot more difficult.
I think that's right.
People can tell when you're being disingenuous, when you're trying to play the sort of political game, calculation game there. So, Rafael, always great to see you and have your insights.
Thanks, Rafael.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it, man.
Coming up, you've seen his films and heard his speeches, but what helped shape the political views of documentarian Michael Moore?
He shares his political journey with us when Rising continues.